Mayoral Memo with Matthew Dickinson from Dubbo Regional Council.
Thank you for joining me, Matthew Dickinson from the Regional Council Australia. Now, the government released its white paper on aviation yesterday and did acknowledge some of the challenges that's going to be facing regional aviation and air travel. What were some of the measures that the white paper discussed introducing to tackle some of those issues, and what were your thoughts on them?
The first thing I think that's important is that they've recognised in this white paper that regional aviation exists, so that's a good thing, and it also recognises the importance of regional aviation and some of the challenges associated with regional aviation. One of the things that's quite fascinating that's mentioned in the white paper is if you go back to 1989, there were 458 regional routes in Australia. You go forward to 2021, the data quoted, and that dropped down to 264 routes. A number of reasons for that drop. Certainly the cost was one significant factor, the cost of air travel and the cost of the infrastructure associated with that. So the airports, the passenger fees, the security screening fees, some of those other costs associated with it. They've certainly identified staff shortages as well. But in the white paper, it does talk about the fact that regional aviation is extremely important. It's not just a luxury, it's not just something that's nice to have, but so many services that are important to regional locations are delivered via air. Now, they might be medical services, they might be government services, they might be professional services. Some people think of an aircraft as somewhere that you go on holidays with, but a lot of those essential services are delivered to regional locations via air travel. So that's extremely important. When we start to look at what are the steps in there that might help address some of the challenges in there, dollars is the first challenge. When we look at regional airports across the nation, we've got some 200 airports that are owned by local government across the nation. Approximately 60% of those don't make money. So they're losing money. They're being subsidised by the communities, and that makes it very difficult. Everything associated with an airport seems expensive. The pavement seems expensive. The security around the whole airport, just securing the area. Then you've got security screening. You've got the terminals themselves. So there are a couple of mentions in the report about some of the regional airports program and the runways, the money for runways. But unfortunately, the dollar value that we're talking about there is fairly low. We're talking about $40 million over a 3-year time frame across all those regional airports across the nation. So probably not enough money to be spent there. And if we could reduce the burden on some of those local governments, then the local governments could reduce the amount of money we charge to airlines. Therefore, that could reduce those ticket prices. So huge amount of challenges there.
Now, with 60% of airports in regional Australia operating at a loss, what is the reason for that? I'm not sure how aware you are of Whyalla's situation, but the Whyalla Airport is currently running, I think, at about an $800,000 per annum loss, and that's been exacerbated since Rex stopped flying routes between Whyalla and other ports. That was a bit of a stoush between Rex, Qantas and the local government here.
So the reasons that local government tend to be subsidising airports are really around trying to marry up the delivery of a service without having too much of an impost in cost. Ideally, if every local government said we're going to make sure that our airports run at least at a cost-neutral basis, that would mean they'd be charging higher passenger fees. And when you charge higher passenger fees to an airline, the airline passes those costs on to the paying passengers, and so obviously ticket prices are higher. So local government is always trying to do the best it can for its residents, but again, trying to keep those costs low means that people can utilise those services. In an ideal world, the federal government would potentially be helping support local government in some of those costs, in some of those operational costs, those running costs. Security screening, for example, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we shouldn't have security screening, but when security screening was introduced in certain areas with certain sized planes, then that introduced an extra cost to local government, which again, we pass on to passengers, so it makes those ticket prices dearer. So it is that ongoing challenge and something that local government's always challenged with, delivering services but trying to cost recover those services.
Now, that was essentially what's happened here in Whyalla, where security screening was introduced and Whyalla became a screening airport where Rex decided, because we are not legally mandated to screen our passengers, they essentially refused to pay that fee and wound up leaving Whyalla. We now only have Qantas servicing Whyalla. And there's been a significant loss in ticket revenue due to, I guess, the high cost of flying to and from Whyalla. And that's exacerbated concerns and fears here locally. With the introduction of security screening at airports, what are some of the things that the RCA would like to see done to reduce that impost on local governments?
In an ideal world, we would have those costs covered by the federal government. We had some support from the federal government in installing some of the security screening equipment when that was introduced. But from an operational perspective, we go out to tenders, we get the best price we possibly can from security screening providers, and then most airports, we take the total cost of the security screening and then on a per passenger basis basically charge that to the airlines and break that up. The problem that you talk about there in Whyalla is exactly the type of problem you can have when you reduce your passenger traffic. That increases the cost per passenger because that security screening has got to be spread out amongst those passengers. So you then increase the cost per passenger, which makes people less likely to fly, which reduces passenger numbers, which increases the price further. So you get this spiral effect in terms of those costs. So Regional Capitals Australia would certainly love to see the federal government step in and basically cover the cost of those screening costs, meaning that we've got security screening, which is important for our safety, but also not at a cost to passengers in regional locations.
Now, with the re-establishment of the regional airports program, now was that the funding that was previously, I guess, the branch that these security screening measures were introduced and things like runway upgrades were also allowed to be accommodated?
Yeah, the regional airports program was certainly a way to have infrastructure covered by the federal government. Obviously, it's a grant program, competitive grants program. The re-establishment is a good idea. The issue that we have with it is just the quantum. $40 million, as I mentioned before, across regional airports across the nation over a 3-year time frame. And again, in my experience in local government, when you mention airports, there seems to be extra zeros put onto any price tag associated with airports. It just seems to be incredibly expensive. So $40 million is not a lot when you try and look at all those airports and all the upgrade work that might need to be done over a 3-year time frame.
Now, you mentioned before how back, I believe it was in the 70s, how there were, 400 plus regional routes being flown Australia-wide, and that number has now dropped into the 200s. What happens to those towns and to those regional areas when a regional carrier stops flying those routes?
It certainly does come down to equality of opportunity, equality of access, and then you have to look at other transport modes. So in some of those examples, I'm sure that cars, maybe trains in some examples, but probably cars and buses would be the transport modes available. Obviously, that increases the time significantly. But I also think what you would see would just be a loss of services. So from a government employee perspective in some of those locations, when they might have been serviced by government employees that would fly out to those locations previously, when they don't have that option, in some circumstances, some of those government employees simply wouldn't service those in a physical sense. They might try and develop some type of remote service model, which is not going to be as effective as that personal face-to-face delivery model. So I think what you would see in the end is a loss of quality of life for people in those locations.
Now, how receptive has the government been to some of the recommendations from Regional Capitals Australia when it comes to that extended federal funding or that extended federal support for regional airlines?
I've been impressed with Catherine King, the minister responsible. We've had her ear. We've been able to meet with Catherine King on several occurrences or several occasions. And certainly I think feedback from organisations like Regional Capitals Australia has helped establish or re-establish the regional airports program. But again, we will always argue for more money, and so we haven't been able to satisfy our desire for a $500 million fund compared to a $40 million fund at this stage, but we'll continue on those discussions, and hopefully things like the development of this white paper and looking at some outcomes from that will hopefully point out the fact that that $40 million is inadequate for the needs of regional airports.
When it comes to Rex and Rex's future, obviously we've seen some pretty scary news with it falling into voluntary administration. Now, per our understanding, its regional routes are still secure. What's your understanding of the situation as it's been unfolding?
At the moment, they're still flying, they're still trading. The administrators took over as of the end of July, so any payments to any of those suppliers are guaranteed by the administrators from that point forward. There's certainly going to be a large amount of money that's lost across the nation from the voluntary administration. The numbers that I've heard are in the vicinity of $600 million. If I take our airport, Dubbo Regional Airport, as an example, there's a debt sitting there of $659,000. As we all know, when a company goes into administration, you're unlikely to get the majority of that. You might get 5 or 10 cents in the dollar, so we might recover a small amount of that, but that will again add to that pressure on the sustainability of regional locations when those locations are not paid money by Rex. And Rex flies into 41 regional locations. The hard part about this is that we still want Rex or other regional airlines to exist and to continue to operate. So our hope is that they'll continue to go down the path with administrators. They'll find someone to buy or to take over that particular airline and still deliver the services that we need into regional locations, because that's the bottom line. We want a regional airline servicing these routes, and the low-cost model of Rex was suited to going to some airports where some other airlines may not have serviced those airports. So we do want to see Rex continue to trade. We'd prefer not to see that debt left outstanding, though.
Now, I understand that one of the measures that you'd like to see improvement on is reforming slots going into Sydney Airport. Is it just been Sydney Airport where slot hoarding and this type of behaviour has been occurring?
I'm only aware of it in Sydney, mainly because of the curfews that are in place in Sydney and how busy Sydney is. So you've got a few things stacking up against themselves there. As I said, the curfew, Sydney is a very busy airport, and from a Sydney airport perspective, they logically would always prefer to see larger aircraft flying in because they charge the airlines on a per passenger basis. So it makes it hard for regional locations. Now, the slots are allocated to the various airlines, and while ever they're still flying, they get to retain those slots. So sometimes airlines will fly or book flights and then maybe cancel those flights to make sure they don't lose those slots. Catherine King has already announced the fact that they are doing a complete review of the slots at Sydney Airport, and I think that's well and truly overdue. I think it's important to make sure that we do have access to Sydney Airport, and with a second Sydney Airport with Badgerys Creek under construction shortly, then we want to make sure that regional people in New South Wales still have access to Mascot and Badgerys Creek. We don't want all regional locations to be sent out to Badgerys Creek because there are sometimes regional people need to get to Sydney Airport at Mascot.
Thank you so much for joining me, Matthew Dickinson from the Regional Capitals Australia.
Great to see the Aviation White Paper for a start, and looking forward to seeing some more outcomes that will benefit regional locations.
Thank you so much for your time.
Mayoral Memo with Matthew Dickinson from Dubbo Regional Council.